It's very interesting. It started with the dissertation, a master's dissertation 8 years ago. And we had to come up with a dissertation topic. I was doing my master's in public policy from St. Xavier's College. I couldn't figure what to work on because there were so many issues. And you're born and brought up in Mumbai. Like this, you cannot pin on what do you want to work in. So I went with the safest thing. My dad is a seafarer. So I was like, let's do something on the ocean because that's something I'm confident on. I have sailed with him. I live on the coast. We are native to Goa. So I'm like, okay, I know where to find my people in case, something comes up. So I did my dissertation on the CRZ, the Coastal Regulation Zone Notification, not knowing back then how big and complicated of a policy it is, and it still is. And so I tried understanding how so many stakeholders, fishing communities, industries like tourism, shipping, and even wildlife as a stakeholder are using the same piece of land, a very small piece of land available for multiple stakeholders. Mumbai as an example too, right? We have residents, we have industry, we are all using the same coast. But it's just one, it's not regenerating, definitely, it's just depleting. And from there, this is back in 2017 when climate change was looked at, purely from that, somebody said, when young people want to do something, it's looked as an attitude. Yeah, so climate change was looked as an activist activity, at least here back in 2015, 2017. And they were like, oh, you're an activist. And I would be like, no, I want data on sea level rise and how is this impacting socioeconomic conditions. And so that's why I think that tag started and I was like, fine by me. I joined an organization called Vanashakti, started the coastal division Sagar Shakti in that. And it was a very different learning curve. On my CV, these projects look great, that I was doing biodiversity mapping for the Coastal Road project. I was doing these various things with mangrove communities. But on ground, the reality was very, very different. These are communities who, when we are putting on an Instagram post or putting it on our report as NGOs or as civil society organizations, we're like, oh, we've done some good work. But the lived reality of that community is that, oh, I don't know if my house is going to be there or not tomorrow, if the tide is going to take it or not tomorrow, right? Or if there's going to be fish, and if that fish is contaminated or polluted with chemicals, and I will not be able to sell it. These are very real things that we are putting up on reports, but very different when the community is telling us these lived experiences. I got to work on something called the olive ridley sea turtle in Goa. I did not know as a Goan that we had sea turtles when I started working on them in 2017. Neither did most of the people know. I remember I was in WWF. I was working with them on a small project and they have a marine office in Goa, and I had gone to the forest ranger where the turtle nesting happens, and I said, I'm from WWF. He said, oh, the wrestling company. Yeah, so that's where we were. We were like, okay, it's all not connected and nobody knows what anybody is doing in the space. To actually starting off there and being one of the authors on the turtle management plan for the state of Goa, right? Turtles we think are cute, are like, oh nice, they come, they go, they don't take up much space, their eggs are in a pit, they hatch, they release. But it's one of the major reasons of conflict in most turtle nesting areas, including Odisha. Because you are sharing that space, so that means you are telling one stakeholder to not use that space, particularly the stakeholder here being tourism and fishing communities. I learned the term environmental defender the first time while we were doing these projects there, because we and our group, and we were doing a project on behalf of the forest department actually back then, and we were attacked by the shack owners. Thankfully, we could escape in time, and that's when we started realizing how, human-wildlife conflict and all of these things feed into it, because now there was less space for shacks. And so they thought the more of this turtle or the more of this conservation and climate activities flourish in this area of town, the more the government will crack down on our activities and our industry. So that's how the narratives change in different locations versus, so this is a very rural part of Goa versus an urban place like Mumbai, Chennai, Kochi, and a lot of these other areas. And then I got an opportunity to work with the National Maritime Foundation. It's the Indian Navy's think tank. They had just started a cluster on blue economy and climate change. So I worked there for a while, seeing how the oceans are looked from a Delhi perspective, from a landlocked perspective, right? A lot of learnings from there, and then I came back, and now I'm with the state, the Maharashtra State Climate Action Cell, Ghorpade sir's office, on behalf of Climate Group. I'm a consultant to them. In between NMF and now, I started my own foundation called Ocean because it was just really difficult to keep reaching out to NGOs to take up coastal projects. So SDG 14, which is the Ocean SDG, Life Underwater, is the least funded SDG. And I can say this because I was a delegate at the UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon. And there also the topic was we are the least funded SDG. So we are having, and we can have a UNOC only 3 years because we cannot afford to do this every year. How much ever we try showing, the ocean underwater, overwater communities, it is still the least funded because it is not our problem. It is not really a concern in an everyday life. If the sea surface temperature is rising or if it has hit a record temperature today or yesterday, right? It's not impacting our daily lives. Yeah, but when it comes in terms of floods, of erratic rains, then we're like, oh, okay, the climate is changing. The ocean is one of your biggest carbon sinks. 80% of the planet is the ocean. And still it's something on the back of our mind, including for Mumbaikars. I live 10 kilometers from a beach and it's on the back of my mind. It's a picnic spot and the ocean is something as another planet, I might say. Coming from a seafarer family, having generations who've been seafarers in my family and fishers, and still it's on the back of my mind. It's like, okay, it's there because I'm not an active stakeholder right now. But for an active stakeholder, the warming of the ocean is concerning. And it's not just livelihood, a lot of these conversations are only limited to the livelihood. Like, okay, livelihoods are impacted, this much money is impacted, and that's over. But there's also a cultural aspect to it, right? A lot of the communities and a lot of communities that even don't live there who have migrated for XYZ reasons like mine, we still have a reverence to the ocean. It is not something that, okay, they're not getting money from it, so we don't care. It is a very different concept. And this is not, I'm not going to say only for India or the West or the East Coast. I would say globally. You look at small island developing countries, one or two just won an ICJ verdict yesterday, International Court of Justice on, and there was such a small country that went to the ICJ demanding climate justice, for the whole planet. And I think that aspect misses out in a lot of these conversations and these concepts. So Blue Justice, specifically from the feminist approach, came actually during COVID. And so like me, a lot of other women, and these were not even privileged women who could speak English or have education degrees, they were trying to resist certain type of development projects. Two of the projects being port projects. And I know some of y'all have, I'm not y'all, but like in general, public have good, narratives about ports and some don't have good narratives about port. But I was part of a people's committee in Trivandrum, in Thiruvananthapuram. I won't name the port, but the Trivandrum port, yes. I'll just call it the Trivandrum port here. And it was very interesting. So they said, okay, you know the CRZ, you know what CRZ means. So you come on the panel and you author this part of the report. So I said, okay, cool, I'll come. I'll get to travel to Trivandrum, which is so beautiful. And that was one of the most scarring, I think, experiences of my life. So when we went there, we were seeing houses, just normal houses like, we have towards the South Bombay front, like Koliwadas or buildings. They were every day being washed and eaten by the ocean. Okay, you can see the cracks, and we thought some JCB or bulldozer has come and cracked it up. And they were like, no, this comes on high tide, takes away a portion of this thing and goes. In fact, it's so bad. There's a beach called Shangamugam Beach, which is towards the airport. And that road keeps breaking. And they said climate change. And when we were going with the community, they were like, no, the monsoon is rough, but because somebody has constructed a lot of concrete on the north side of this beach, the erosion has started happening on the south side. When we went for these people's public hearing, it was by the community. So the unions had invited us, and I will not name the authors of that report, but it's available, and that organization. So when we were talking to the men, it was like, okay, 5 lakh compensation is not enough. We calculated it's coming up to 10 lakhs per family, so that's the compensation we want. When we spoke to the women, they were like, no, we are not okay with any compensation. We will eat 10 lakhs, but what will our children take and what will their children take? And they were like, we have sustained because we had food security. We had a place to rest. We had a place of, celebrating our festivals. Where are we going to do that now? We don't have any culture to the inland side of the town, and so where are we going to have that space? And so the women's perspective was beyond livelihood or finance. It was cultural, it was spiritual, and it was very intergenerational. I think I can use that term in this example. And that's where the concept of climate justice intersecting with feminist principles, intersecting with blue justice, which is ocean specific. Like when you look at the coast, the policy is so unique that sometimes even the National Green Tribunals cannot make sense of what should be the verdicts for this, right? Because when you look at a forest-based thing, it's a landlocked terrestrial thing. It does not keep shifting with the tide. A coastal zone keeps shifting with the tide. High tide comes, you just hope that it's not getting eroded, and while the low tide goes, you hope that the coast is there. It's that dynamic. And so it becomes very difficult from the policy space also, which is why the whole term of blue justice came, and I started mentioning it in many of my works. Yeah. Within NFF, I'm no longer with NFF now. I was there with them for a good 2 years, and I think the first challenge is patriarchal. Right? Because your policy narratives and people just dismiss it like, how, okay, patriarchy is there, it's not there. It may be an issue today, maybe not an issue today. I know I'm feminist, so it's not an issue, definitely in the work I'm doing. But it really shapes a lot of narratives and a lot of policies, even political will coming out from there. The political will within the fisher folk community is also driven by patriarchy, right? Men are supposed to fish on the boat, women are supposed to sell the fish. 2 categories, yes. If even little bit interchange happen, they're like, okay, now that's the boundary, Sarita, you are at. You can tell them to an alternate industry, like tell them to do tourism, tell them to do conservation, tell them to go surfing, but not fishing. We are very set with our rules. So it starts with this. And so when they are talking to policy makers, they are talking about the same things that they want, right, for their community. Most of the fisherwomen that you speak to, if they have children, they don't advise them to become fishers. They are always telling, get an education, either leave the country or migrate inward to an office job, right? And that's how the narrative is changing. Within the political will space, in fact, it has been very interesting because I have seen political will very forward for climate action because their audience knows about this versus not in favor because their audience doesn't know. And I met Sonam Wangchuk when he had come to Mumbai a few months back, and I asked him this question that you are saying this, that, but what about the political will? And he said, yeah, because we are that minority that sees this, road over forest as an issue. But 98% of the remaining public does not see that as an issue. They want that because they also have social injustices that has also led them to want this basic infrastructure, right? From the space of privilege that we are sitting there, we're like, how can a road go over a forest? Is very different from, say, someone a tribal who migrated to a village, then migrated to a city because there were no opportunities back then. And now it's like, okay, this development should be there. It is good because we didn't have it, or we lost people for XYZ thing. So I will not get into the exact example he gave me, but linking social justice with climate change, I think, has been a very formative part of my work and a focus in all that I do since the last 5-7 years now. And with the State Climate Action Cell and with Climate Group, I feel lucky that they also recognize these concepts, right? So I think to really bring it down, it comes down to allies, right? It really comes down to who's your ally, and if you have an ally who's a politician, if you have an ally who's a bureaucrat, it really comes down to that, because they are the people who can then make a real difference and even have the listening capacity to really take something that can make a positive impact or is equitable and just for all forward. Yeah, fortunately, we do have a fisheries department which has clauses to recognize fishing populations. They are socio-economic indicators and so on and so forth. But that's largely on paper, because fishing as a sector is a state list. It's not very much governed by the center. So a lot of the schemes and a lot of these things go towards only boat and fuel and these things. But because the women are coming up now, because they're also getting an education, and they can also see, what's the issue and what's not. Some of them are taking leadership. But yes, there's not a lot we can do with this mass population. This is conversations we have that will there even be an NFF after 10 years or not? This was a very strong union, that was instrumental in making the CRZ policy, in fact, back in the 80s and 90s. And most of the answers are maybe not. Apart from policy, which can change and which could, also be more flexible for the community, it's also climate change. There's a lot of loss of life. It's very risky. You can at least guarantee that your child will live a full life if they are doing a white-collar job than on a boat with a random storm or cyclone or just random things happening. And also, there's a lot of work. So whenever they bring a catch, I don't know if you've ever gone to Saswan docks, you'll see a big hoard of plastic first. So there's this additional labor of paying the additional labor, and you have to have that skill set to remove those tiny, tiny plastics from the fish, right? It is just increasing the load also of this industry, which is why a lot of commercial aquaculture is taking that place now. And I will not get into aquaculture. Just to come down to the State Climate Action Cell, so I'm working in building technical capacity for the cell, for the city officials, for the district collector officials, in developing their own climate action plans. I'm also working on the heat wave side. And we recently had an urban heat data jam also with the department and the cell, where we were asking people to make their own heat wave action plans ward-wise, right? And include citizen science in a lot of this planning, because that's the missing link. You make a good cap, you make a good plan, and then the people don't know how to read it. It's jargon, or it's something that why is this there in the first place? So we're trying to really build capacity first for the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 cities of Maharashtra itself, and then the district collectors, because yes, there's a GR, they are like, okay, we have read it, okay, we have to form a cell and a plan, but why are we doing this? They've literally asked me like, Sarita, ami kashala karte? Like, why are we making a plan which we don't know what is vulnerability assessment and what is the meaning of this? So within the cell, that's what I'm working to build capacity of, and other things, other policies that come up, like the EBA policy has recently come up, ecosystem-based adaptation. So we're working with partners who are working the State Climate Action Cell on these policies. Yeah. So the Mumbai Urban Heat Data Jam was one that I had co-organized. So we had invited citizens to come, and we gave them 5 wards of Mumbai, and we gave them problem statements and data. So people also were GIS experts, but people were also normal citizens. So we made sure the equity of each group was that the skill sets are there. And they analyzed the heat data of that ward and came up with solutions. This we presented to the BMC's Environment and Climate Action Cell, and they were like, wow, we did not know that citizens could have capacity to do this. And they were excellent presentations, So that's how we envision it. There's a lot of stereotypes of, technical people and citizens. But the technical people are part of that citizens also, is what people don't see often. And very good perspectives that can come out of there. So that's how we're trying to integrate citizen science with these kind of things.